Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Bill Doherty, who will present Beyond Polarization, Navigating Differences with Respect Rather Than Rancor. Dr. Doherty is a professor in the Department of Family Social Science at the University of Minnesota, where he directs the Minnesota Couples on the Brink Project and the Citizen Professional Center. Clinically, he focuses on couples on the brink of divorce and on political stress in relationships. Based on his experience teaching in family medicine departments, Bill has done consultation groups for primary care physicians for over 40 years. Following the 2016 U.S. presidential election, he co-founded Braver Angels, a citizen initiative bringing conservatives and liberals together to counteract political polarization and restore the fraying social fabric in American society. Braver Angels now has volunteers working in all 50 states. Among his awards is the Lifetime Achievement Award for the American Family Therapy Academy. Dr. Doherty, thank you for coming to Idaho. Please welcome.
She got through those announcements pretty well, don't you think?
Yes.
I'm glad it was a little boring because the worst thing as a speaker is to have the intro be hilariously funny. In fact, I had a colleague who, when she would introduce people, she would show cartoons. And the audience would be rolling with laughter. And then they would say, okay, now I'm here to go on. So thank you for a low-key. I know you could have had them on the floor, but you chose not to. Also, speaking of welcomes, I just want to say that Steve was now eating. How's the food, Steve? Just keep going. He met me at the airport, and it's not that big an airport, really. And my plane was early, which meant they had no gate. Okay, because another plane was there. So we were texting back and forth, and he told me exactly what kind of vehicle he had, what kind of door to meet. Not that hard, but in the window, the passenger side, was this sign. And it not only has my name on it, it has the Braver Angels logo. I mean, that is a first class. So you can keep eating now. Well, Vitality series, what a good name, for a series. And I want to congratulate you for deciding to have something on how to maintain wellness and vitality in the face of political stress. The term political stress, I heard for the first time in the mid-'80s when I was outside of the U.S. I was doing a presentation in Panama to family physicians. And I was going through what are some of the stresses that your patients and families are under. And so, it was the normal medical stuff and poverty and so on. And then they said political stress. And I asked them to say more about that. And that term wasn't used in our country, but now it is. It is, because political stress has invaded our lives, our professions, our families. So we're gonna talk about that in the form of talking about polarization. And so where we're going to go tonight is I'm going to start broad, and I'm going to engage you in interaction and conversation throughout. And we're going to talk first about the problem of polarization at a national level and what some of the sources of it are. And then I'd like you to be thinking about where it's showing up in healthcare, where you're experiencing it. And then we'll go back and forth on that. And then I'll talk about the work that I and others have been doing in Braver Angels to try to counteract that polarization, and what I've learned about ways in which in our own lives we can engage people in a way that does not exacerbate the polarization but instead reduces it. So So that's where we're heading. And some of you will be in a workshop tomorrow where we'll talk about some of the skills involved in this work. Okay, so the problem of polarization, the political scientists have been studying this, historians have been looking at it. And so I want to say what I mean by this. I do not mean differences on issues as much as differences on how we treat one another when we disagree about issues. There have been times in our country where we had far more left-wing and right-wing. I mean, back in the 30s, we had Communist Party, we had neo-fascist party. We differed hugely on policy issues. We still do today, but the big rise in the last 35, 40 years has been on what political scientists call affective or social polarization. And that is how we regard our fellow citizens who vote the other way and support candidates that we don't support. There was an article in the journal Science a few years ago where a group of social scientists who study this kind of crystallized the research and crystallized the description of this affective or social polarization. They also call it sectarianism. And keeping in mind, it's not how you and I regard any particular public official or party, but how we regard the 70+ million people who voted differently in the last presidential election. Some of whom are in our families. By the way, families are the last bastion of unintended political diversity. And that is, you go out, you go to a family reunion, you're going to have lots of differences in a way in your friendship group, you may not, in your neighborhood, you may not. Okay, so the three characteristics that this group of scholars talked about to describe polarization are, first, that we see others as alien, incomprehensible, don't get them. How in the world could they support so-and-so? How in the world could they believe such and such? And I invite you to think about yourself, of whether there are times when you say to yourself, I can't understand how could somebody believe the election was stolen or the election was not stolen. That Trump ought to be re-elected or not re-elected, that Biden should be, on and on. How can people possibly believe that? So people who vote differently are alien, strangers, can't get them. So alien is the first one. The second is unlikable and untrustworthy. So not only don't I understand them, I don't like them. I don't trust them. There's been a measure of affective polarization that political scientists have been using for decades now. It's called a feeling thermometer. And what they ask people is from a 0 degrees to 100 degrees, what's your overall feeling about your own political party and then the other political party? And so most people, consistently the last 4 decades, view their own party at around 72 degrees, sort of perfect, San Diego weather, I always find. Very nice. And they used to regard the other party at maybe 56, kind of cool, like Minnesota in October. Livable, not San Diego, but not terrible. Not Minnesota in January. And what's happened is, not that people love their own party more, they dislike the other party more, so that the temperature is going down closer to the freezing mark as people regard the others. And one of the ways they translate this is that out-party hate is now greater than in-party love. So it's not that we are so much fonder of people on our own political side, it's that we are so much more turned off to people on the other side. So alien, unlikable, untrustworthy, and here's the clincher, morally compromised. Bad people. Bad candidates that I abhor, they must intend the bad things that I think are going to occur. In other words, they are ethically compromised by supporting the other side. That's a pretty tough combination. I don't understand you, I don't like or trust you, and you're probably a bad person. Welcome to America, 2023. That's the end of my talk. An illustration of this in my area, which is marriage and family work, in 1960, only 5% of Americans said they would be uncomfortable with their son or daughter marrying somebody of the other political party. It was basically kind of irrelevant. When I was growing up, whether you were Catholic or Protestant was really big. And then even, I was Irish Catholic, so even Italians, Catholic, but so we talked about those things, but we didn't really talk about whether somebody was of the other party. That has now gone up to 40 to 45% of Americans say that they would be uncomfortable with an inter-party marriage in their family. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. And it's not that we've become less tolerant in general, because attitudes towards interracial marriage have gone in the other direction. I mean, when I talked about Catholic Protestant, interracial was like, we never think about that. You saw an interracial couple on the street, it was like, what is this? And that has changed dramatically in this country. So it's not that we're just less tolerant in general, but around political parties, we certainly have been. And it's been consistent then with what sorting. That's what the political scientists talk about. We're sorting ourselves now by profession, by neighborhood, by states. I don't know if you've been reading about people moving in and out of states. Well, Idaho, based on political party. If you were looking for a house in a neighborhood and you drive through during election season, which is basically 12 months a year, people will decide whether to move there based on the signage. Based on the signage. So if you can tell if it's what we call red or blue in Braver Angels. We talk about red being more conservative, tend to vote more for Republicans, blue more liberal, tend to vote for Democrats. If you drive through a neighborhood and you see signs that say, hate has no home here, is that a red neighborhood or a blue neighborhood? It's a blue neighborhood. And it's not that red's like hate, but it's a signal of something. It's a signal of something. If you see we support our local police, it's a red neighborhood. If you see flags, it's a red neighborhood. Okay. If you see one of those signs that has many, many words on it, it's blue. You have to walk up a little line to see the number of people that person loves and supports. You don't have to read it, you just know it's blue. And so increasingly choosing each other, there's a group of political scientists who wrote a book called Prius or Pickup. That was something. Academics usually don't get to write books like that, but anyway, it's great. And so pickup symbolizes what? Red or blue? Prius, hybrids. Not that it's 100%. The beers that people drink. Okay. Bud Light versus, okay, you beer drinkers, what's a good blue beer?
Any microbrewery.
Any microbrewery. Even knowing the word microbrewery, I'm saying that in public. So our language has become red or blue, and it becomes difficult to navigate. So terms that are dear to people on one side, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, all the way down. Didn't used to be. Fiscal responsibility, self-sufficiency are now seen as red times. And people get activated by these. And what I'm here to say is there's nothing inherently political about any of those terms. But they have been caught up in all of this. In fact, I'll tell a story that I was asked to give a workshop at my University of Minnesota for a group of faculty. And these were award-winning faculty. They won campus-wide teaching awards on how to manage political diversity in the classroom. And I was talking their red and blue language. And so I was throwing out some of these terms. And what I said was, I'm going to use a term now, and I'm going to ask you to say what's your gut reaction to it. And I said, self-sufficiency. And a faculty member said, racist. She saw that word as racist. Powerful. She was a white woman. About 3 people later who raised their hand was a black woman. Again, these were all faculty who said, I want to go back to that because when I grew up, self-sufficiency was a big value in my family. In fact, my parents used to say, don't expect white people to come and rescue you. And so we were raised to be self-sufficient. So it's not a racist term. So, but can you see how, now, so in fairness then, could anybody, this will be the first question to the group, in fairness to the faculty member who had their reaction, how could somebody view the term self-sufficiency, where would that come from, the reaction that it was right-wing and therefore racist? Where would that come from?
The welfare.
Yeah, welfare debates. Right, exactly. So it's not that she just made this up out of nowhere, because when we get into debates about policy, we then tend to polarize around taking care of the needy versus undermining their self-sufficiency. And that's actually an important conversation to have. You need a safety net, but safety nets can be so, can be so tight that maybe people lose incentives, right? So it's like, what's the minimum wage? If everybody, there's some limits to where we can't sustain it. So we need conversations about how we navigate care for the needy and the value of self-sufficiency so that people don't have multiple generations on welfare. But it's gotten so polarized that the very term self-sufficiency, then means to a faculty member that is racist. So that's some of where we've gotten. So this has been rising for 35 or 40 years in this country, not just since 2016. It's been rising through multiple administrations. It's probably peaking now. And it's happening in Europe. Think about Brexit. What's happening in France and other countries. It's happening in Canada. There are western provinces of Canada who are wanting to do their own version of Brexit. And polarization is rising in our dear northern neighbors who look at us as the crazies. So so I'm urging you to think more broadly than its particular political party or particular president, and it's not even just in our country. And so it's in politics for sure. And so this will be a little call and response here. What other domains of life and social institutions are now invaded by polarization that were not 20 years ago? Where else is this showing up? Just call it out. Schools.
Libraries.
Libraries. Libraries. Libraries. I mean, it used to be the word library and boring, right? I just saw the newsman recently, and now a librarian, but libraries just getting torn apart about this. School boards. School boards used to be, the school board meetings used to be kind of dry. And now, there are anything else like that. So what are some other institutions? Healthcare, yeah, we're going to talk about that one. Yeah, healthcare for sure, yes.
They're showing up in one of the main places that caused it in the first place, and that's media. 24-hour news.
Yeah.
Is when peak difference is down.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about sources in a moment, but certainly the media. Certainly the media. We now have kind of specialized media, lots of polarization, and feeding it as well. What other institutions? Church, religious institutions. Religious institutions. I was asked to do a workshop as part of Braver Angels for Lutheran pastors in southern Minnesota, rural Minnesota. They're just really getting it. They're being asked to come out of the pulpit for particular candidates. And this, didn't learn this in seminary. Where else is it? Law enforcement. Law enforcement. Yeah. Big time. Big time. Workplaces. Workplaces have gone, particularly big national companies, very much into diversity, equity, inclusion training, and particularly after the George Floyd's killing, and big backlash occurring there. So workplaces, and then, Target is headquartered in Minnesota, so Target goes along with one group, the trans group, with some clothing, and then they get whopped by people who oppose that clothing, and then they get rid of the clothing, and then get whopped by the original people, and they're trying to make money. They don't see themselves as ideological, but the workplaces are all over this. And then families. A recent poll found that 10% of Americans report a cutoff of a family member over political differences. A cutoff, not just you don't hang out with them, but a cutoff. And this is sort of one of my areas, and I began to see, and this has really happened, I believe, after 2016, that we have people who threaten divorce. I talked to a fellow therapist, marriage therapist, that told me that she told her husband, she's a blue, he's a red, they've been married 26 years, they dealt with those differences, that if he voted for Trump, she would divorce him. What's going on?
And
so this and families, pardon me?
are they still together?
I don't know. Well, I think he didn't vote, he voted for third. But the thing is, in marriage, your victories can be worse than your defeats. You win certain battles, and you may lose over the long run. In fact, in one of the consultation groups I do for primary care physicians called Ballot Group, a couple weeks after the Trump's election in 2016, one of the cases that physician presented was of a middle-aged woman who came in with terrible abdominal pain. And on physical exam, the doctor wasn't seeing what was going on, and just the woman looked really distressed, asked her what was going on. Her son, her husband's son, who had joined the Peace Corps or some similar thing, was in Nicaragua. The family never discussed politics. He called home to talk about the election and learned that his parents had voted for Trump. And he said, "You're no longer my parents. I will never speak to you again." Now, some of them, he's a gay young man who was very fearful for what could happen. But then he said that, and the mother was just completely beside herself. Thank goodness the doctor asked her how her life was going, and not only did that work out. So we have a big problem. Next thing we're going to talk about are sources of the rise of this polarization, and this will be prefaced to then talking about it in healthcare. So I want to do a little discussion exercise with you. I'd like you to ask yourself, what are some of the sources of the rise in polarization over the last 3 decades or more? What are some of the sources? And remember to be more complicated than to just say it's the other political party all night. Because it's happening in other parts of the world, and it's happened for multiple administrations, and so let's think in a complex way about it. The other thing is, since this has risen so dramatically, whatever the sources are have to be things that are new or have changed. So it can't be human nature, because presumably human nature hasn't changed that much in the last 35 or 40 years plus. So what has entered our environment, or what has increased or changed or decreased in our environment that has led to this rise in polarization, and of course it will be multiple things. So here's the exercise. I'm going to give you a moment to just think individually, take a note if you want. What are some of the sources of the rise in polarization in the last 35 or 40 years? Keeping in mind to think in a complex way. So I'm going to give you 45 seconds to think about that, and then we're going to have you at your tables do some discussion, and then we'll kind of pull those. So again, moment of reflection on some of the sources of the rise in political polarization, and then we'll have some discussion. So begin a moment of silent reflection now. Okay, so here will be the directions. If you have 4 or fewer at your table, everybody thinking, count 1, 2, 3, 4 here, then do it at your table. If you have more than 4, I'm only going to give you 4 minutes, so it won't be enough time. If you have more than 4, divide it in half, okay? Rather than doing this whole table. So you have 4 minutes, get it out, brainstorm your way. Don't turn on the audience. Let's just do this in popcorn style. I'll do a little repeating for folks on Zoom. So what is one source of polarization that you talk about in your groups? Social media. And just a sentence about why social media is an influence on polarization.
It gives access to so much information all at once, right at your fingertips whenever you want it. And so people can go on and be an expert, and other people believe it.
So she said it gives you a lot of access to information and misinformation, of course, instant authority and spreading it. So I'm glad you said it first, because that's the one that all the political scientists point to. It wasn't around 35 or 40 years ago. It's new, and it's often what's called an accelerant of polarization. Okay, that you there's other stuff going on, and then you boom, you'll go viral.
But it's also the algorithm that drives.
The algorithms where you get the social media knows your preferences and knows how to appeal to fear, outrage, grievance, and our brains, as we know, you're going to be doing some stuff on the brain and wellness. That's what kept us alive. When we were out in the jungle. I think that's a tiger out there. The ones who said, I'm getting out of here, they passed their genes on. And those who said, it's probably a little kitty. And so it appeals, it becomes an outrage machine. And people say things on social media they would never say in public. It makes people brave in a way that are not really brave. So it's a huge, huge factor. So what else?
I could be wrong on this, but the media being so biased. I mean, look back when I was young, like newspapers didn't endorse candidates. I mean, news channels didn't endorse candidates. They just sort of say the news. And now, like everybody's got to endorse someone. The states have got to endorse a candidate. The news channels. So there's such a bias now in the media and the news that there wasn't before.
so news, if you go back 50 years, there was a lot more kind of homogeneity in news, like television news for old timers. Remember, there were 3 networks and public television, and basically the news reported was almost the same. You could go back and forth. You didn't get a lot of differences. And now news media is specialized audiences. They're 24/7, and people then can access the channels, if you will, the outlets that are consistent with their own views. Now, there were downsides to the homogeneity of the old system, so let's not be romanticizing that. There's lots of things that couldn't get said there. But now we just have this Tower of Babel and much more permission in journalism to slant. I just think that's really the case. And there's a lot less trust in news media now. The good news is that they're starting to worry about it seriously. So actually, the news media folks have been approaching Graver Angels about doing some work with them. On Tuesday, after I go home, I'm doing a workshop for senior news media for Minnesota Public Radio. Because it's gotten so bad for Minnesota Public Radio that no Republican in the state legislature will do an interview. Now, you can say that's fair or not fair, but certainly the perception is there of a lot of bias. So, okay, another one. What else did you talk about?
Distrust of authority with fallen authority figures, disappointing, betraying.
Yeah. And the distrust of authority and, in fact, of social institutions in general, where, like medicine, right? Religion, the courts, universities, there's been a major decline in people's trust in social institutions. Just think about the courts, for example. Like the Supreme Court used to be revered, and now, really not. And so a huge decline in trust, and we'll talk about that in terms of healthcare in a minute, but that's a huge factor. And sadly, it's also accompanied by strong declines in people's trusting of one another. So since the 70s, there's been this linear decline in people answering this question on national polling of how trustworthy do you think most people are? How much can people be relied upon to do the right thing? Majority of people back in the 70s said, 2/3 of people thought, yeah, most people pretty trustworthy. Declining a lot. And each generation, since the greatest generation and then the baby boom, each generation is starting off less trusting. So the millennials are less trusting than the Gen Xers, and the Gen Zers than the millennials. So this is a big factor. So it's the decline in social trust. What's another one? Yeah.
We talked about the insecurity that people feel with globalization and a lot of movement of people around the world, and then also exposure to the fact that there's a lot of trauma as well, and traumatized people moving into your neighborhood, and then you become traumatized.
So he's talking about, I'll keep repeating these for the folks online, the increasing mobility, immigration, people moving, refugees, people moving across nations. Whenever you have high levels of movement around like that, you have social anxiety. That's just always been the case. So now we're in countries like Scandinavia that used to look down on us for how we were handling social mobility and immigration. They're experiencing it, and they're having the same problem. It's really very difficult. So that's been happening. You're saying increased trauma. I'm not so sure that we have more trauma now, but I think we have fewer supports for managing it. I mean, it's just my own opinion about that.
Just exposure to the fact that trauma is.
And exposure, because we see it all.
Yes.
Good point. 9/11, we all saw it. We didn't just read about it. Yeah. So how about another one?
disparities, like the haves and the have-nots are growing further apart?
So disparity, social, income inequality, social inequality, those breed dissension. And they set up countries for demagoguery. They set up the possibility of leaders coming along and saying, those people don't care about you and I care about you. And so then you get sort of negative populist movements going on in a lot of different places. Anything else? Yeah.
Money in politics.
Money in politics, not in Idaho. No, it's not true, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's another one that everybody points to. Sharp increases in money in politics, special interest money. I talked to somebody who is a congresswoman from South Dakota, and they only have one member of Congress there, it's a small state. There were millions of dollars, special interest money, poured into that state to defeat her. There was no way she could compete with that. And that kind of thing did not happen as much before. The members of the House, according to a member of the House who I know and believe is trustworthy in this, he said that the average member spends at least 35% of their time raising money. They have to leave their office to go across the street on the phones because you can't raise money from your own office. So they're spending all of the time. It's a huge factor. So thank you for those. And some others like gerrymandering. There's only 10 or 15%, most of in Congress, in the House, of districts that are competitive. And so what it means is that the threat to your continuing in office is not going to come from the other party. It's going to come from people in your own party, often who are more radical. When I was doing a workshop with members of Congress, a member told me, he's from a western state, he said that if a photograph was taken of him shaking hands with the member of the other party, and that got out on social media back home, he could be primary. And he would lose his funding. So lots of these factors that have gone into this. And now we're going to turn to healthcare. And I'd like to do the same, I'd like to have you ask this question for yourself. Where is polarization showing up in your world? I think most people here, some are physicians and nurses and others, some therapists, some maybe in management. So wherever your world is in healthcare, where are you seeing polarization show up? And so I'd like to give you a few more seconds to think about that, and then back into your small groups to talk about where is it showing up in a way that was not there before. So a moment of reflection. Hold on, this is the quiet moment of reflection.
Oh,
This is the time you think, and then you talk. Okay. This is called a shaming tactic. Obviously, I know people it doesn't work with out here. So take a moment of reflection, and then I'll have you back in the groups. Okay, back in your groups, 5 minutes. Where is it showing up? Where's polarization showing up in your world?
Public health mandates.
So let's just a little. So people on the Zoom can hear without me just repeating everything. Yeah.
Public health mandates.
Well, give us just another sentence about that.
Well, especially here in Idaho, there were actually fights. There were protests when the public health departments got together, and it became political because our public health officials are appointed by political officials. And so those political officials, instead of appointing people who might have had some interest and learning in public health issues, put lawyers and other people on the public health boards. That caused a lot of polarization.
A lot of polarization there, yeah, thank you. Somebody else, what is it showing up? Oh, you got a lot to say at your table. There we go.
Here at the table, there was a conversation about how this distrust for patients has grown so much that they question everything that we as providers or healthcare workers have to offer to our patients. You know, I tell my research, or can I get a prescription for ivermectin, or different things. So I think that's one way that it's become polarized. Before, at least I think it felt like my patients were willing to listen a little bit more, but nowadays that seems to have changed.
Yeah, the conversation over here as well, that something happened with the COVID crisis and the polarization, the divisions that occurred there, that is now carrying over to other areas. Somebody at this table is talking about statins, kind of boring statins. So there are things that get caught up, and it's also it's clear that that people, Reds have become less trusting of many of our institutions like medicine, healthcare, universities than they were before, so that begins to generalize. So thank you. Yes.
Right. So I work in infection prevention, so a lot of our
A
basic.
little closer to that.
So our infection prevention concepts, just washing your hands, wearing a mask, isolating patients suddenly became a political issue, which made it really challenging as far as providing care and not spreading infectious sources around the hospital.
Just the stuff that was so routine before now becomes, once something enters the red-blue divide, it becomes very difficult to even have a rational discussion about it. Very simple. Thank you. Somebody else? Yeah.
Probably can't even do it justice with one word, but the laws, right? Lawmakers, things that are now enacted in law that doesn't allow, providers to make decisions based for the people they care for. And they could be held liable and be put in prison and such, our last discussion was moral injury, right?
Yeah.
So gender identification, whatever, abortions.
Yeah.
I mean, so many workplace violence, it just goes on and on.
Yeah, there's a way in which we've had the, professions, in the history of professions, medicine, law, are kind of the oldest professions along with ministry. The bargain between the government, the state, and the profession was with government saying, we trust you to self-regulate. And we'll set up a licensing board, but it'll be mostly your folks, members of the public, and then legislators in the executive branch, unless you break a obvious law, you're stealing money from your patients, we're going to let you handle that. And it's all based on trust. And when the trust erodes, and you have tremendous lobbying systems and money, you were talking about money, you have lots of pressure on legislators and the executive branch to breach the membrane between the state and the profession. And here's the thing, that I'll give you just my opinion now, that if you celebrate the laws you like, be careful because there's going to be other laws. So I'm a therapist. I've never thought that conversion therapy was an ethical, let alone effective way to treat gay people. And my own view was that once legislators started to pass laws banning it, and these sort of liberal legislatures, that we're all playing with fire. That the therapy profession should handle that. You know, look at all the terrible things that medicine did, you know, lobotomies, and you know, I mean, it got handled. Okay, it was a terrible practice. The research came along, and so, you can't do that. You're going to malpractice. You're going to lose your license. Let's handle it within. When we go to the legislature saying, with pressure, even on something I agree with, the conversion therapy said, you ban it, then the next pressure group comes along and says, we're going to pass a law on this, and you're going to go to prison for it. So the membrane gets breached, and it's a membrane about trust. And I think that's part of what's happening. And then each side starts to lobby, so you get the states having, you know, practicing medicine in different states becomes so different. And this is a dangerous trend. What else did you talk about? Yes. Yeah.
Here in Idaho, we had some political extreme
A little
militia.
closer to that.
We had like a local militia that has been people with guns at our hospital and threatening people, and we have to have security watch for that. Some political extremes that have really impacted health because they don't agree with medical treatment.
Okay, one more, and then I'm going to solve it, by the way. We have 25 minutes, and you're going to leave feeling great.
We were just talking about how it's also affecting recruitment. So for residency programs that get federal funding, we can no longer use race as a measure for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our recruiting classes.
Would you be also willing to talk about a concern about within medicine, when you get, I'll put it in my words, when you get groups who have a particular political bent, you were just saying you wonder about how people who don't have that bent are going to feel with their colleagues. If you're willing to say that, I just told you what to say.
Exactly that. Yes,
You shouldn't have messed with
I
it.
think it's going on.
Yeah, okay.
But what you said.
Anyway, yeah. Yes.
What you said, that some of our colleagues might be staying quiet, while the majority are much louder.
So there can be a kind of, if you're in a group that feels a sense of outrage about how the other side is treating you, then you can, without meaning to, really marginalize people within your own group who don't agree with you on everything. And so you get the silencing that occurs within. I call it the water cooler effect. Not that we get water coolers anymore, but if most of the people in your work group would be happy or unhappy that Trump goes to prison or something like that, it's tempting to talk with one another as if everybody agrees with that, which is exactly a violation of what we would like in terms of an inclusive environment. Very difficult to have strong convictions politically and hold on to respect for people who differ from you. Very tricky. So that's, I'm going to make the transition now to what I've learned in the Braver Angels work, which did not start with some big plan. Braver Angels we started it 2016, week after the presidential election, which everybody remembers. Got a call from my colleague David Blankenhorn in New York City. He and I worked on family issues, fatherhood issues for years. He ran a think tank. He had been on the phone. He lives on the Upper Side of Manhattan, where you couldn't find a Trump voter, but he's admitted it. He was on the phone with another colleague that both of us had worked with on family issues, David Lapp, who lives in Southwest Ohio, that was 70% for Trump. and they were talking about how people were feeling about the election. It was gloom and doom, and the world was ending in Manhattan, and it was hope and change, morning in America in Southwest Ohio. And they decided on the spur of the moment to get 10 Hillary Clinton voters and 10 Donald Trump voters together for 13 hours over the weekend in Southwest Ohio in early December. And they called me, and I had the same reaction number you did. Good luck. And then I said, what were you thinking of doing with them? And they said they didn't know, but they thought maybe I could figure that out. And then it was no longer funny. And I remember they had the weekend, and I remember looking at my calendar, hoping I was not free. Like, I'd love to be able to, you know. Anyway, I was free, and I just said, okay, gonna go for it. So we had people from that part of the country, South Lebanon, Ohio, that county, Warren County. Half were enthusiastic Trump voters, half were enthusiastic Hillary Clinton voters, and we brought them together to see if they could talk with each other, get past stereotypes of each other, see if they could find some common ground. And the first question we asked was, why did you come? Because everybody's really nervous. Do you remember what that time was like? And what they said was they came for two reasons, and this has been true of our, we've done 2,500 prayer angels workshops now. They're worried about their community, their country, and they're worried about the families. And they were around the community, they were saying, we have schools to run and a hospital to maintain and roads to build. We can't do it if we're just fighting each other. We've just been fighting each other. And so they engaged each other and found that they had a lot of common values and aspirations. And the difference around Trump and Clinton didn't have to define them. It was a very powerful experience. And we wrote a document together that everybody signed. And it was interesting. Before they came, everybody was individually called and vetted for this. And a lot of people on both sides said, I'm willing to come. But you know, people on the other side, they're just emotional. People on my side, we deal with rationality. But I'm willing to come. Everybody thought that. So I thought this was going to be a one-time experience, a great cocktail conversation. Ask me what I did in December of 2006. But they didn't want to stop. And so I cashed in another frequent flyer ticket and went back to Ohio. And just, they said we have to keep going, we have to do something with this, and we agreed. And so we decided to keep going. And I knew that 13 hours was going to be too big a time, so I designed briefer versions, 3 hours, 7 hours of this, and developed other workshops. And we made a decision early on that I commend to you as you think about what you can do with polarization affecting healthcare in Idaho. We decided that our leadership had to be half red and half blue from the beginning. Half red, half blue. So I spent the last 6 years in continual communication with people who differ from me politically. But we all care about the problem of the division in the country. And there is an effectiveness that comes from this. There's a way in which our workshops do not sound red or blue. They've all been vetted. We don't say we want to build a membership that's diverse. We say we want to build a membership that looks like America. Because reds and blues both can resonate with that. And it means diversity. But it's not using the language. So understanding that red and blue have become like ethnicities or even religions with internal language, coherence, values, stereotypes of the other side. What happens when you engage with people who are different from you around politics is the same thing that happens when we engage with people who are different from us, racially, ethnically, sexual orientation, whatever. You get to know them as people, not as stereotype. So that as we've had our conversation here, that's one of the lessons I want to commend to you, at our table, we were talking about how it's primary care can be seen as more blue, certain specialties more red. If you can get people working together across red or blue within your field, you're much more likely to be creditable. So all of this work in Minnesota has led me in the last week. We're going to launch an initiative called Reduce the Rancor, Minnesota. And we've been looking for co-sponsors, visible Republican, visible Democrat. Tried the mayor, tried the governor, didn't quite make it there. But through connections, some of which I have because of my own political orientation, some of which I have because I have close colleagues who are friends who are on the other side, I managed to have meetings with the heads of the Democrat and Republican Party, brought them together for lunch last Tuesday, and they signed on to be the visible co-sponsors for Reduce the Rancor, Minnesota. And why? Because they're concerned about the state, they're concerned about the very issues we talked about here, and they're concerned for how it's hurting their own parties. This is where you harness self-interest. You get social change when you harness concern for the public good with self-interest. The self-interest is the Democrats who control a lot of state offices in Minnesota, the progressives and the moderates are fighting each other. We had violence at a nominating convention in one of the wards of Minneapolis. Violence. The head of the Democratic Party was not happy about that. We have in rural Minnesota, which is more red, we have the Trumpers and the anti-Trumpers and the fire throwers, and so the political parties are having trouble as well, as we know. In fact, Howard Thurman, who is one of the mentors of Martin Luther King, once wrote that hate, once released, will not be confined to its original object. Hate, once released, will not be confined to its original object. And so part of what I've learned is not to just fight what I see as negative with more negativity. To not fight stereotyping with more stereotyping. So we've had these workshops that we've been doing, 2,700 of them at this point. And as we've gotten more courageous, braver, by the way, we started out with the term better angels, from the Lincoln phrase, the better angels of nature. And then we got sued because somebody owned the trademark. They said, we will crush you. This little nonprofit, okay, so we changed it to braver angels, we kind of like that. But we've taken on bolder issues. So we've had a series of what we call common ground workshops around the country in the last year on the question of trustworthy elections. There's hardly anything more divisive right now. And we have a process, because the whole thing is how you create the structure and the process. We bring together 8 people who think the election was stolen, and 8 people who think it was not stolen, that it was a responsible election. And we lead them through a process of listening to each other, and both their values, we talk about values, concerns, and solutions. And here's the thing, we're pointing to the future, not the past. We're not debating the 2020 election. They come together to say, what did we learn from that election to do better in the future, the next election? And in the process of listening to each other, structured exercises where you listen to people's stories, you listen to their views, their values, and what they would do in the future. And then each group goes to a separate room, having listened to the other, and come up with a list of values, concerns, and solutions that they believe, like I'm in this room, we support these, and having listened to the other side, we think they would go along with it. We think they would support it. And then they come together, each group, and they sort of discuss these and they vote on them. And they have to have an 80% agreement for something to be their collective agreement. There's been 30 of those that's happened around the country. There's more occurring, and there's going to be a document that comes out of this, because up to now there's 120 agreements on values, concerns, and solutions. And people then, when they hear the stories, when they hear stories of other people, they say, okay, I may not agree with you that it was as big a problem as you thought, but we have to build it in a way that you're a person of goodwill, that you don't have this serious doubt. Okay? That would be something on the side of somebody who thought it was a trustworthy election. Somebody on the side who thought it was a fraud election is hearing you tell the story about your relatives in Georgia who had to travel 4 hours to vote, lost a day of work, and they're saying, that's not right. That's not right. We can't be passing laws to make it hard for people to vote, but they stand in line. But you see what happens is people, they're not doing talking points, they're talking about the convictions. So we're going to pull this together in a document of people from around the country who differed on this and the common ground that they came to. We'll see where that would go. We did one on abortion. The first common ground workshop we did was on abortion, with a group of pro-choice and pro-life, strong pro-choice and pro-life folks. And they came out of it with 12 solutions they all agreed on. Better access to birth control, better sex education in the schools, better infant nutrition programs. So blues were for the nutrition programs and social justice there. The pro-choice, because the pro-life folks wanted mothers to feel like they could feed their babies, so that the alternative of being able to bring your child to term was viable for you. And you see how both sides can get there. But of course, they were not going to agree on certain kinds of restrictions. So this has left me with hope that if we can create structures and processes on the grassroots level to bring people together, we can make headway. And we're now, fortunately, we're attracting political scientists to study these. So they've been doing randomized controlled trials with standardizing. It measures polarization, and I'm glad to say it's working. Okay, so it isn't just that people feel good about this. People do make some shifts. And a key thing is we're not trying to change people's views, we're trying to change their views about each other. And when that happens, when you and I can sit down and find something we value and agree with, and not just what we disagree on, we're more open to finding that common ground. And so in the last couple of years, we've started to get interest from elected officials. So these are some stories I'll end with here. Because the two biggest legitimate criticisms of our work in the first 4 years or so were, A, do we know this is effective? That's beyond people saying they really like the workshop. And so now we're getting evidence that they are effective. And then the second one was, well, what about politics? What about elected officials? What about media? What about the social institutions? And so that's where some of our major work now is happening. Because what I can tell you is, from doing workshops with local officials, county, some legislators, they are, at least states that I've been in, they're not happy in their jobs. The polarization we're talking about that you're facing in your work, they live it every day. And a lot of them hate to go to work. They hate to go to work. They get demonized by colleagues, in social media. Their families get threatened on both sides. They're not happy. And so they're interested in learning. So we're doing workshops now called Managing Difficult Conversations with Constituents and Managing Difficult Conversations with Colleagues. And what are the skills? And the point is, and this is what we'll be working on tomorrow, that we live in an era where we need more skills because because the trust is lower. So a lot of the skills that I've taught and try to practice, and then you do in healthcare, are about collaboration, not being authoritarian, but collaborative. And that seemed to work for a while until the trust got down, and so it's hard to be collaborative when somebody doesn't trust you. So what are the skills involved in this new environment? And so that's what some of the elected officials are realizing that they need to develop as well. And so one of my favorite things that I have been involved in, and very interested involved in, with elected officials, these are at legislatures in New England. I don't want to overemphasize this. We just have a handful of legislatures we work with. It's not close to 50. But at a workshop in New Hampshire, we had 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats who were leaders in their parties. And Speaker of the House said, we're going to start doing something. So we brought these together. And before we did the workshop, the Speaker of the House looked at the list. No, the Secretary of State looked at the list and said, who brought these people? He's getting a little nervous. But this is the exercise we did. We had them in groups of 4 and 4 to answer this question. Everybody got 5 minutes, uninterrupted, to answer this question. What life experiences have influenced your values and beliefs about public policy and public service? What life experiences have influenced your values and beliefs about public policy and public service? And I suggested they go deeper than, when I was in junior high, I was elected to my class president, and I didn't go a little deeper, which they did. We gave everybody several minutes to prepare. And then talking stick format, going back red, blue, they told these stories. It was compelling. It was powerful. And a highlight of it was a Democrat sitting here said that he grew up in the foster care system. His father abandoned the family. His mother suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and he and his siblings bounced around the foster care system. And this became a driving experience in his life to try to make a difference for these kids and families so that you didn't have kids in foster care, or a better system if they had to. Driving force. He finished the story. A Republican on my right said, I don't believe this. He said, I grew up in the foster care system. And he told his story. And it's part of what has driven him in his career in his own politics. The Democrat was more interested in government solutions and government aid. The Republican was involved in the voluntary sector, the faith community sector. He got involved in unions and so on. He was more skeptical of what the government could do. But the goal was the same. The goal was the same. These two guys, they only knew before that they differed on the role of government. But they never knew what was underneath it. And then the last story did this with some members of Congress. If you want to feel a little hope, Google the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House of Representatives. Problem Solvers Caucus. It's about 35 Democrats, 35 Republicans in the House, a few senators as well, who are committed to bipartisanship. They have lunch every week. They work on internal reforms in the House. They were really hugely responsible for the infrastructure bill that passed, that helped save us during COVID. And so they heard about Braver Angels. So this is what I'm so happy about. I got a call from the chair of this. Okay, I usually don't get calls from members of Congress, so I thought I'd take it. And he said, it's time that you guys do something with us. So we did a couple of workshops where we brought Republicans and Democrats together, and I'll just describe one of them and we'll finish up. It was the life experience exercise. And there was not a dry eye in the room by the time we finished. There were stories of family loss and tragedy. A woman who, after she was widowed, decided she was going to make something of her life and went into politics. And a conservative Republican from a western state, I won't say his name, even though the press were present for this. They allowed the press, and they showed this vulnerability. But anyway, he said at the beginning of the introduction, I'm as conservative as the day is long. But I'm a pragmatist, which is why I'm in the Problem Solvers Caucus. We're going to have to work across differences. And then when he told his story, he talked about growing up as a single mom. His father left the family. They had no running water when he was really little, and struggled to get a good education. His mother took him to the state house when he was 10 and said, "You could be or something. You could be or something." And so he made one of his life's goals. And so he told that story, and he had listened to everybody else's stories, including somebody whose family grandparents were all killed in the Holocaust. These are powerful, shaking stories. And then when we asked people what they're taking with them at the end, this was his line. He said, "What I'm taking with me is that you can't fight somebody in the same way when you know their heart. You can't fight somebody in the same way when you know their heart." And so I believe that we can use the kind of humane ways that we know in healthcare how to deal with one another and be in relationship across partisan divides, and we can make a difference against